Chief Brian Irons, the psychopathic leader of the Raccoon City Police Department, the man who was an integral part of the downfall of not just the RPD station, but the whole city as well. With his evil nature and his many dealings in the dark, this character was known to be hated by many Resident Evil fans. So in this video, we'll be discussing Chief Irons as an overall character, starting from his original version from Resident Evil 1.5, to his initial debut from the classic Resident Evil 2, and finally to his latest version in RE2 Remake. We'll also discuss all the shady antics that he's done during his tenure as Chief of Police and how that led to the Raccoon City incident. Anyways, before we do get started with the video, I just want to say my name is DeVuH, and I do cover a lot of Resident Evil and The Last of Us content on my channel. So if you guys are interested in that type of content, then please feel free to like and subscribe for more videos like this in the future, and also possibly adding me on Instagram and on Twitter, where you guys can message me there at any time. Alright, so let's go ahead and start our discussion by quickly analyzing Chief Irons in the Resident Evil 1.5 version, which actually was the original draft version of RE2. So Chief Irons, believe it or not, was actually supposed to be a good guy who would support both Leon Kennedy and Elsa Walker during their journey in this early version of RE2, where he was known to have been injured during the Raccoon City incident and has left him limited in his office, staying most of the time laying on the sofa, where he would advise Leon or Elsa about what has happened and would assist them in any way he could. Also, Chief Irons in this Resident Evil 1.5 version looks slightly different compared to the final iteration that we saw in RE2, where this time, he wears an entire blue police uniform with a very high semblance to Leon's attire, but his facial features and his overall build was roughly the same, which finally translated to his final version that we saw from the original Resident Evil 2.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I thought you were another one of those zombies.
Also, Chief Irons in this Resident Evil 1.5 model had it mostly in his office, which this is one of the many differences that we've seen with his character, where it looks like your standard office in RE 1.5 compared to his more suspicious version in RE2, where he shows off his many taxidermy and artwork collection, but I'll get to that a little bit later in the video. Anyways, this early version of Chief Irons will go through a large change, not only with his attire, but his whole character overall, because with the final product that we saw from the original Resident Evil 2, he was now known to have transformed into a corrupt chief of police, a man who was working closely with the evil Umbrella Corporation and would eventually have a mental breakdown during the Raccoon City incident. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and discuss the origins of this new and revamped version of Chief Irons, starting with his days as a youth and as a university student, where in the Resident Evil Chinese manhwas, Brian Irons was shown to have the tendencies of a serial killer already, where he would hunt and capture little animals and would mutilate them for his pleasure, which these actions has a very real and high correlation to the real-world serial killers, because based on the research that the FBI has conducted on the many serial killers in the past, there was a definite and high tendencies that these criminals who committed murder have also abused small animals in the past, with a psychological impression that these criminals feel in full control, almost having that sense of high due to their perceived power over their victims. So with Chief Irons' case, him showing this attribute early on already tells us what kind of person he could possibly become. But as he grew up and became a university student, this man's tendencies to commit criminal acts has only begun to start, where he was known to have committed some egregious acts of hostility and predatory things to his fellow female students, with the only way he was able to get away with such acts was by bribing the upper administration of his university and having good grades, which to me can't justify his criminal acts. Anyways, besides that point, he would then lead a life working as a police officer in Raccoon City, while at the same time enjoying his pastime leisure of hunting down animals and adding them to his taxidermy collection, which this aspect would continue on until he was finally appointed as Chief of Police of the Raccoon City Police Department, which to this day still baffles me on how the hell he became Chief of Police, let alone a police officer. But I digress, because now, Chief Irons has now been put in a seat of power, a position that would change many lives in the Resident Evil series, with the very first aspects would be his corrupt dealings with the Umbrella Corporation, because mind you, Umbrella already had full control of Raccoon City, where they had some high-ranking city officials under their payroll, which allowed them to pass laws that would benefit this evil company. So having some close ties with Chief Irons would be the next step for Umbrella, having both legislature and the police force under their control. It was almost impossible to implicate them of any wrongdoing, so Brian Irons has his role of acting as police chief, while also turning a blind eye to all the Umbrella's dealings and research into the T and G virus.
Prowling around at a time like this. You're after G too, aren't you?
which he would be handsomely compensated, feeding into his frenzy of buying his weird art collection for his office, which some files from Resident Evil 2 has shown this side of Chief Irons, more specifically the notes from the secretary, where the passage covers some details on Chief Irons between the dates of April, May, and June, where it reads, "On April 6, I accidentally moved one of the stone statues on the second floor when I leaned against it. When the chief found out about it, he was furious. I swear the guy nearly bit my head off, screaming at me to never touch the statue again. If it's so important, then maybe he shouldn't have put it out in the open like that." Then on April 7th, I heard that all the art pieces from Chief's collections are rare items, literally worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know which is a bigger mystery, where he finds those tacky things or where he's getting the money to pay for them. Then moving on to May 10th, I wasn't surprised to see the chief come in today with yet another large picture frame in his hands. This time, it was a really disturbing painting depicting a nude person being hanged. I was appalled by the expression on the chief's face as he leered at the painting. Why would anyone consider something like that to be a work of art is just beyond my comprehension. Then the secretary's diary would then continue on, moving on to the month of June, where she says, "On June 8th, I was straightening up the chief's room. He burst through the door with a furious look on his face. It was only been 2 months since I've started working here, but that's the second time I've seen him like this. The last time was when I bumped into that statue. Only this time, he looked even more agitated than ever. I seriously thought for a moment that he was going to hurt me." Then moving on to the final entry in the secretary's notes, where it says that I finally discovered what the chief was hiding all along. "If he finds out that I know, my life will be in serious danger. It's getting late already. I'm just gonna have to take this one day at a time." Anyways, after reading this file, it's already obvious that Chief Irons' mental stability may be compromised, with his constant acts of anger and paranoid tendencies. It was only a matter of time before he finally snaps, which actually happens during July 1998, the time that would finally unravel the Umbrella Corporation and revealing the truth about the T-Virus, with the specific events happening in Resident Evil 0 and in Resident Evil 1, where the RPD STARS team was sent to investigate some bizarre murders in the Arklay Mountains, to only find out that the Umbrella Corporation was behind many illegal activities of experimenting on both humans and animals for the sake of the T-Virus research, leading into the outbreak that would later cause the Raccoon City incident. But after the STARS members returned to Raccoon City after their stay at the Spencer Mansion estate, Chief Irons saw to it that this team would be disbanded immediately under the Umbrella's orders, and would deem them incompetent and ruin their reputation among the people of Raccoon City, where he would place Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Byrne, and Rebecca Chambers under administrative leave, silencing their voices about what had happened during Resident Evil 1. Also during this time, there were some rumblings of cannibalistic attacks going within the city already, indicating that the T-Virus infection was already in full effect, turning the townspeople into ravaging zombies and monsters, leading Chief Irons to have a mental breakdown as he watches his town fall apart before his eyes. But knowing Chief Irons, one would think that he would make his escape while he still can, but instead, he decided to go full psychopath and showing his true side before the events of RE2 and Resident Evil 3, with his actual debut was when Claire Redfield met him in his office, sitting behind a desk with a dead woman right on top of it, who happens to be the mayor's daughter, who was supposed to be protected by Brian Irons, but instead became another one of his victims, continuing on his sadistic nature of harming women from his early years as a university student, where we compare this to Leon's campaign, where you find out some details about Chief Irons' dealings from Ben Bartolucci, an investigative journalist who was inquiring about Brian Irons, and found out some details on how he was working alongside with the Umbrella Corporation, which Chief Irons found out about and put Ben behind bars to keep him quiet.
Just get me the fuck out of here!
Anyways, also during this time, there were some files of him showing his evil nature, where he wrote down this: "On September 23rd, it's all over. Those imbeciles from Umbrella have finally done it. Despite all their promises, they've ruined my town. Soon the streets will be infested with zombies. I'm beginning to think that I may be infected myself. I'll kill everyone in this town if this turns out to be true." Then on September 24th, I was successful in spreading the confusion among the police as planned. I've made sure that no one from the outside will come come to help. With the delays in police action, no one will have a chance to escape my city alive. I've seen to it personally that all the escape routes from inside the precinct have been cut off as well. There are several survivors still attempting to escape through the lower levels, but I'll make sure no one gets out. Then moving on to the last entry on September 26, where it says that I've had a change of heart about the remaining survivors inside the precinct. I've decided to hunt them down myself. I shot Ed in the back through the heart less than an hour ago. I watched him writhe in pain upon the floor in a pool of his own blood. The expression on his face was positively exquisite. He died with his eyes wide open, staring up at me. It was just beautiful. I wonder if the mayor's daughter is still alive. I let her escape so I can enjoy hunting her down later. I'm going to enjoy my new trophy. Yes, frozen forever in the pose that I choose to give her. Whoa, after reading this, it really cements this character as someone who we really love to hate, where he spreads the mass confusion among his staff, cutting the connections to the outside world, spreading the ammunition caches throughout the precinct, and hunting down the remaining survivors was just appalling. It also doesn't help the fact that he has a secret torture chamber room near his office, where only God knows what he's done during his tenure as police chief.
Gee, don't play dumb with me. Hello. Aren't you Dr. Birkin's?
Also, the fact in RE2 Remake's version, he's shown the same psychopathic and hostile tendencies to both Claire and Sherry Birkin, showing he has no remorse for his actions, whether they be hurting an adult or child. But with all the atrocities that this man has committed, it was rewarding to finally see karma get back at him, with RE2's many iterations showing their own version and how this madman finally meets his end like shown here.
What the?
I bleed. That's not supposed to happen.
Your fault.
What?
It took too long.
What happened? Oh god. Get off me! Oh my god!
I'll be honest, my favorite version of Chief Irons' end was actually in the original RE2, where William dragged him down and threw him right back up after he was done with him, which is much deserved after everything he's done. Anyways, let's continue to briefly discuss some new additions that they made for Chief Irons in RE2 Remake, showing him to be a prominent feature not only in the RPD station, but also at the orphanage area, where he would terrorize Sherry Birkin as he was trying to find and capture the young girl. Also with this version, he was a lot more open with his psychopathic tendencies from the get-go, where we compare this to the original Resident Evil 2, where he just wanted to be left alone for a while before meeting him again at the torture chamber room, because this time, he openly detains Claire Redfield, kidnaps Sherry, and proceeds to blackmail our character from afar. Also another addition to Chief Irons was his log of his taxidermy notebook that he had, writing down some of his successful hunts of animals, but the last passage was the one that really got me, again adding more to his evil and sadistic side, where it says, Pig, female, 22 years old, place of capture, Raccoon City, length, 5'3" and weighs 110 pounds. The specimen's body is soft, sweet, and white all over. It's all mine, forever. Anyways, in the end, Chief Irons was a for sure major catalyst during the events of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and seeing him again in RE2 Remake was a great treat for us fans, again giving us an iteration of a character that we'd love to hate. But as a growing rumor of Resident Evil 3 Remake possibly being announced in the near future, it's only fair to assume that we can see this character again, and see what he's been up to during Jill Valentine's journey in the RPD station. Because just to clarify, Resident Evil 3 happens a day before and after RE2, so having Chief Irons around the RPD station during this time is still a possibility, where we could possibly see him do some of the horrendous criminal acts like he mentioned in his files, where he would hunt down the survivors, or cut the communications off to the outside world by destroying their equipment, or showing him to spread panic among his staff by giving them false information and leading them right into zombies, monsters, and possibly nemesis. which that would be a cool aspect to see on how the downfall of the RPD station happens before Leon or Claire make it there, with Jill Valentine also possibly having some type of interaction with the police chief prior to finding Nemesis herself. Anyways, what do you guys think about Chief Irons, and should he make an appearance in Resident Evil 3 Remake? Please let me know and why on the comment section down below. Also, if you guys enjoyed this content, then please feel free to like and subscribe, and checking out my other Resident Evil videos on my channel, where I discuss the many other characters that surround the Raccoon City incident and Resident Evil 3. Anyways, thank you guys so much, and as always, you guys have a great rest of your day, and this is Hey DeVuH, and I'll see you guys on the next video.